Well, good morning, River Glen. Man, as beautiful as it is outside, and you guys still came to church, you get extra credit today. Well done. Great to see you. It's an honor to be with all of you here in the room in Waukesha. Welcome to everybody who is watching online right now or maybe listening to our podcast. And of course, a huge welcome to all my friends over in Pewaukee. I hope you guys are having a great weekend. Well, we are in this series right now called While We Wait. And I just thought we'd start off today by having a little bit of fun. Are there any music lovers out there? Anybody just love music? Yeah. Some people like music. The rest of us love music. I definitely fall into that category. And what I love about music is that a lot of times a song can really just kind of capture you. Really kind of captures where you're at or what you're going through. Maybe a feeling you're feeling or a moment you've had or maybe even a whole season that you've gone through. Songs just have the ability to do that. A lot of artists are gifted enough that they have the ability to articulate what we go through even better than we do. And sometimes songs can even become like an anthem for us to really just kind of push us forward and carry us through. I don't know if you've ever had this experience before, but we've got a couple songs queued up today. Maybe these have served you and may resonate with you in the past. If you remember them, feel free to sing along. We're going to have a little bit of fun with this. Well, maybe you were a sports fan and your team just dominated the competition. You had an amazing season, and this was your song. Sing this one. Hiding till. Gotcha. Or maybe you weren't a sports fan. Maybe you just had a best friend. Or maybe a group of friends, and you guys, you were tighter than glue. These were your ride or die before that became a thing. And this was your song. Remember this one? No, not going to happen. All right, maybe, and I'm sure that some of you are out there. Maybe some of you are a fellow textbook Generation Xer like me. And if you're a Generation Xer, that means you were born to rebel, to fight the system, to cut your own path. And that means this was your song. I may have listened to that one a little too much growing up. All right, this last one I'm sure we can all relate to. Maybe you went through a tough challenge, right? You weren't sure if you were going to make it or not, but you pushed through, you persevered, and this was your song. We'll give it a shot. Oh, we're halfway there. Sing it. For all the youngsters in the room, you can just Google all those songs and you'll figure them out later. All right. I love a good song. Love music because songs remind us that other people have gone through the same stuff that we've gone through. Real people going through real stuff. And that right there is one of the biggest reasons why I love reading the Bible. Because the Bible is full of stories, full of real people going through real life. The good parts of real life and the tough parts of real life. Did you know there's actually an entire book of songs in the Bible? We call it the book of Psalms, P-S-A-L-M-S. And just like songs in real life, some of the Psalms are great, and they're joyful, and they're triumphant, and they're all about moving forward. But some of the Psalms, about a third of them, are what we would consider to be the Psalms of lament. They're Psalms about the other side of life, the tough side. They're songs about grief and loss and pain. I picked one of these out to see if maybe this could trigger you, or this might resonate with a season that you ever had. Psalm 6 says this, I am worn out from sobbing. All night long I flood my bed with weeping, drenching it with my tears. My vision is blurred by grief. My eyes are worn out because of all my enemies. We are in a series right now talking through 2 first-century letters written to a group of Christians. And they talk about and they describe how we could and should be living as followers of Jesus, waiting in hope for his return someday. And over the course of this series, we're going to talk about a lot of things, but today we're going to talk about the idea of grief and loss and grieving. Because just like back in the first century when these letters were written, grief and loss are just part of life. It happens to all of us. And the verse that we're going to take a good look at, we're going to look at this a lot today, we're going to put it up on the screens for you, is this. 1 Thessalonians 4:13. And it says this, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. And here's why this is so important for all of us. Because grief not handled well leads to more grief. Pain not handled well leads to more pain. Maybe you know somebody. Maybe it was even you. Maybe you know somebody who went through a season of grief and loss and they didn't handle it well. And it spilled out onto everybody else and it caused even more pain and more grief. One author said it this way. I thought this was so good. When she talked about our pain, she says this, if we don't talk it out with someone, we'll take it out on someone. I just thought that was such good wisdom. And so that's really the big question we're trying to go after today. We know we're going to grieve. It's part of life. How do we grieve well? And before we go any further, I just want to take a second. We're going to pause. And I just want to recognize anybody here in the room in Waukesha, anybody listening right now, any of my friends over in Pewaukee, you came here today and you're barely holding on. You are deep in your season of grief right now. If that is you, probably the most important thing you can hear me say today is this: God sees you. He sees you and he sees your pain. Another one of those Psalms of lament says this. It says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You've recorded each one in your book. God sees you and loves you and wants to carry you through this season. I wondered if you'd just let me pray for you. Would that be okay? Can we pray together? Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for the power and the wisdom and the comfort we find in your word. And I pray for every single person listening to this right now who walked in here deep in grief and pain. God, I pray that through your Spirit you bring comfort. I pray that through your power you bring hope. And I pray that through your wisdom you bring purpose in our pain. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, well, let's throw that verse back up again. Let's talk through this. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. That first word we want to look at is that word uninformed. Uninformed. Because the problem they had back then when this letter was written is the same problem a lot of us have today. Most of us, sadly, just weren't taught how to grieve, much less how to grieve well. I mean, were any of you taught how to grieve in school, right? But yet, were any of you warned that grieving is going to be a part of life? Yeah, most of us weren't. There's not good training for this. In fact, most of us get the exact opposite. Most of us are not taught how to grieve. We're taught how to get. Right? Get good grades so you can get into a good school, so you can get a degree, so you can get a good job, so you can start a family, buy a big house, fill it full of stuff, and take 2 vacations a year. Now, hey, listen, there's nothing wrong with that. That actually sounds pretty good to me, right? But no one ever stops to take a time to tell us, hey, what do you do when some of that stuff doesn't work out? What do we do when a parent dies? What do we do when the career or the dream falls apart right before our eyes? What do we do when our spouse leaves? There's just not a YouTube channel for that, is there? And so we don't want to be uninformed when it comes to this idea of grief. We want to be informed. And so the question is, what is grief? Grief is what? What would you put in that blank space? We'd probably have a pretty good conversation, wouldn't we? Probably spend a few hours on this. There's lots of words you could put in that blank space. I've got a few that I just want to give to you for your consideration. I think they might be helpful as we try to understand this thing called grief. And the first one is this: grief is hard. It's just hard, man. Grief is hard. Ask anybody who's going through it or who has gone through it. They will tell you it's unlike anything they've ever experienced in their life. And it's multifaceted, right? Nothing else in life affects so many different pieces and facets of who we are as people, right? It's not just emotional pain, it's physical pain, it's spiritual pain, it's mental pain, it's relational pain, it's all of it wound up into one. For most people, getting through grief will be the toughest challenge they face in this life. Grief is hard. Another word we can put in there is this: grief is complex. It's just complex. It's hard to understand. And it's different for most people. I've been taught that if you've met one grieving person, then you've met one grieving person. No two are alike. No two people go through grief the same way. Here's why. Because every single one of us has a unique relationship with that person or that thing that we lost. And so our grief journey will be unique as we go through it. And so I just learned to hesitate putting people into categories or trying to tell people what stage they're in and that, because I just don't think it's helpful. I think each person's grief journey is unique because grief is complex. Another word we could put in there is this: grief is long. It's just long. It just takes a while. Most people grieving, myself included, would say that we've been in the grief journey longer than we anticipated. There's just not an expiration date on the side of the box. Grief just takes as long as grief wants to take. And it's usually longer than we think. And this last word, maybe this will be the most helpful for you. Grief is normal. It's a part of life. Everyone living will experience grief. Because everyone living will experience some kind of loss. You will lose someone or something you love. And so the question again is not will you grieve, it's will you grieve well. Grief is normal. Some authors even take it a click further, and they say grief is not only normal, it's necessary. It's necessary because of the growth and character that only develop through deep pain and deep loss. And losses come in all shapes and forms, don't they? There's lots of different kinds of losses. Go back to our verse real quick. It says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep." Asleep. The word asleep there means death. It means those who have passed away. Right? A lot of times in biblical literature, sleep and death are kind of synonymous. Right? So the context for this verse is the Apostle Paul had traveled to this little town in Thessalonica, and he planted a church. And he raised up a couple of leaders, and he kind of got the church up and running, and then he left to go plant another church and another one after that. And he left this little church, this little body of believers there to go through life. And just like real life, over the course of years, some people passed away. And the believers that were there in this little community, they didn't know how to handle it. They weren't trained on this. One scholar calls their experience, they were hopeless in their grief. And so that's the reason behind Paul writing this part of this letter, right? And we can all relate to this. All right, when you become a follower of Jesus, you don't know everything right away. For a lot of us, you got to relearn how to do all of life with Jesus at the center, right? So that's the context for this verse, and these folks had dealt with death. And death is probably, I think we probably all agree, death is probably the most significant of all the types of loss. That's certainly been my experience and my family's experience. Some of you know a little bit of our story. The last few years for us have been really hard. It started in 2018 when we lost my dad. He went into the hospital for what we thought was just a pretty textbook, simple infection, and he just never came home. A couple years later in 2020, we lost my wife's dad. He got real sick real fast, and he passed away. And because of all the travel restrictions that year, we couldn't travel to him. We couldn't go to him to be with him in his last days. We couldn't say goodbye. We couldn't participate in his celebration of life. And then the next year, 2021, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. She fought as hard as she could for about 6 months, and then she passed away. And then in 2022, we lost my stepmom. She got sick. And again, happened pretty quickly. She passed away, and she's with my dad now. And then last year, 2023, I flew back home to California. I got to say goodbye to my best friend. He also got diagnosed with cancer, and I was one of the few people who were able to be with him in his last 24 hours on earth. And so 2 dads, 2 moms, and a best friend in about 5 years' time. It's been a hard journey. I don't at all try to come across as an expert on grief, but I'll tell you, I know what grief feels like. I know how hard it can be. And I know some of you out there, some of you listening, know this kind of pain because you've been through a season like this. And I'm sorry for your pain, and I'm sorry for your loss. But death isn't the only type of loss. Right? If we go back to that definition, maybe this will be helpful for you. What is grief? The textbook definition says this: grief is the emotional response to life-altering loss. That could be a lot of things, right? Divorce would be a life-altering loss, no matter what side of it you're on, right? When your health falls apart, that's life-altering loss. When the dream dies or the career falls apart, that again is life-altering loss. Even something as simple as becoming an empty nester. I mean, that's a good thing, but that's still a life-altering loss and deserves to be grieved. How about a few years ago, right? Remember that? When the whole world flipped upside down? Didn't we all experience loss during that time? We lost our sense of trust and safety and security. We all suffered loss during then. Some of us are still putting the pieces back together. So loss is everywhere. The question is, what do we do about it? How do we get through it? I'll go back to our verse. It says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do." And that's the question. How do others grieve? How do most people grieve? What are the most typical responses to grief and loss? I'll tell you what I've seen. Typically, we do three things. We numb it, we avoid it, or we just move on too quickly. We numb it, avoid it, or move on too quickly. Reminds me of a story of a couple of golf buddies I heard. These guys, they loved golf, played it all the time. They're out playing golf one morning, and one guy's about to chip up onto the green, and he sees this long funeral procession driving by. And he stops, right in the middle of his swing, he stops to pay his respects. And he takes his hat off, and he kind of bows his head, and his buddy even thinks he heard him whisper a short prayer. And when he was done, his buddy says to him, "Man, that was really thoughtful. That was very kind of you." And he says to his buddy, "Yeah, it's the least I could do. We were married for 35 years. Forgive me for that. Most of us just don't know how to go through grief, and so we just fumble our way through it. In doing the work for this message, I came across a fabulous resource called the Grief Recovery Handbook. It's a great tool for you or anybody you know going through grief. And in this book, the two authors talk about the things we most commonly think and the things we most commonly say to others to try to help them in their grief journey. And although it sounds helpful, these authors would say these are some of the most unhelpful things that you can say to somebody. We might mean well when we say it, but these are the things you definitely don't want to say. See if any of these sound familiar to you. First thing we sometimes say to people is this: "Hey, don't feel bad. Don't feel bad." Right? The authors tell the story of one woman who lost one of her twin daughters. And she had more than one person tell her, "Don't feel bad. You still have one child." What a horrible thing to say to somebody, right? How about this? Sometimes we say to people, or we think, you just need to replace the loss. Right? Don't worry about grieving it. You just fill that hole with something new, something different. You'll be just fine. How about this one? You just need time alone. You just need to grieve alone. That's actually probably the most unhelpful thing you need. That can be very destructive, as we're going to see in just a minute. Probably this one you've all heard: just give it time. Time heals all wounds, right? Have you heard that? That's actually not true. Time does not heal anything. What you do in the time is what brings healing. Time by itself does very little. How about this one you've heard? Be strong for others. Just put your feelings aside. You need to be strong for others during this season. I don't think that's helpful. I think what would be more helpful, rather than trying to be strong, is you just be real and be a model for what grieving looks like and walk right into your grief. How about this last one? We probably all said this. You just need to keep busy. Get back to work, get a hobby, just keep yourself busy. That'll help you get through this. Listen, I have done and said every single thing on this list, and I have found that none of it is helpful. Because it all misses the one key thing we need to grieve well, and it's the last word in our verse. We're going to put it up one more time. It says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope." Hope is the key. Hope is the difference. Hope is the point of this verse, and if you zoom out, it's the point of this whole passage. Hope is the point of this whole conversation we're having today. As followers of Jesus, we have been given the gift of hope to carry us through our grief. And the hope that we carry inside us is two-sided. And the first side of our hope is just this: we have hope that there is more to this life than just this life. We have hope in something beyond this. After this, we have hope beyond the grave if you have the faith inside you. Some of you probably heard this quote before. The famous evangelist Billy Graham said this before he passed away. He said, "Someday you will read or hear that Billy Graham is dead. Don't believe a word of it. I shall be more alive than I am now. I will have just changed my address. I will have gone into the presence of God." That is the kind of hope we get to carry. As followers of Jesus, we believe that all people, everyone who have confessed their sin and asked for forgiveness, have received the gift of salvation. And for us, for those people, death will not be a period, it will only be a comma. A tiny little brief pause between this world and the next world. And the rest of us that are left behind, although we grieve, we feel the pain from it, we grieve in hope that we will see them again. I will see my parents again. And I look forward to that moment. That's the kind of hope that we get. And the other side of the hope that we carry is this: that no matter how deep our pain, no matter how heavy the loss and how heavy the burden is we carry, if we have faith, we know that we do not carry it alone. God is with us in our pain, every step of the way, every tear we shed. Many of you know this story. The Christian artist Toby Mac lost one of his children to an accidental overdose a few years ago. He's been very open and talking about it. He's even written a couple of songs about it. In one of his interviews, he said this about his grief experience. He says, "The truth is, I didn't know grief, really. I just felt like everything was beautiful and perfect until the last few years. And then when we lost Truett, everything changed. And I met grief in the fiercest way." He goes on to say this, that God doesn't always take away the cold. He promises that he'll be right there in it with us. And that is what I held on to. Hope is the key. Hope is what sets our experience apart from everyone else's. And through all the pain and all the loss that we will experience in this life, this is what I have learned, that what we believe determines how we grieve. It's what we believe that determines how we grieve. And our faith becomes the foundation that God uses to rebuild us and to rebuild our lives on the other side of the significant losses that we will endure. And through God's love and grace and generosity, he also blesses us with the three things we need to grieve well. We're going to talk about each one of these because I think they'd be helpful for you or anybody you know who's going through grief right now. Three things we need to grieve well, and the first thing is just this: it's awareness. Just awareness. What is grief? Grief is a real thing. And the fact of the matter is that the deeper you loved that person or that thing you lost, the deeper your grief experience will be. And so for many of us, probably the best first step is just to say, hey, I am grieving. I am grieving. I won't always be grieving. There will be a day when I move forward, but for right now, I am grieving. One author says to take that just a step further and actually write a letter. He suggested write a letter to your friends and family members, coworkers, neighbors, just explaining the season you're in and asking for a little extra grace and a little extra support while you grieve. That's good advice, right? Another thing about this awareness is just give yourself grace. Give yourself grace while you grieve. Give yourself grace and give yourself permission to feel and go through whatever you happen to be going through that day. Just take it one day at a time. Most people don't know this. That little quip, one day at a time, Jesus said that. That's the words of Jesus, Matthew 6:34. Don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today. Just take it one day at a time. For some of you, that's too much, so just take it 1 hour at a time, or one task at a time, or one decision at a time. You don't even need to be grieving to do that. That's just good life wisdom, right? Another thing on this idea of awareness is just be aware of triggers. Triggers. Ask anybody grieving. They'll tell you triggers just come at the most random times and places. And triggers can actually be a good thing because they remind us that what we lost was special and it deserves to be celebrated and remembered. I had this experience just recently. My family, we had to take a Disney vacation this year. This was a first for us, and we had a blast. Last night we were there in the park. We watched the big fireworks show in front of the giant castle. If you've ever been there, you know that the finale of the show is this moment when Tinkerbell flies off the tip of the castle and sails all the way across the park on a zip line. Really cool, really powerful moment. But for me, it wasn't powerful, and it wasn't cool. As soon as I saw her fly off the tip of the castle, I was instantly 7 years old again. And I was standing at Disneyland Park in Anaheim, California, next to my mom. Disney was very special for our family. And we watched that moment many times together. And in that moment with my family, just a few months ago, I was so sad that my mom couldn't be there. And even more sad that I couldn't call her afterwards to tell her all about it. It's standing there in front of about 8,000 people. I was a wreck, man. I lost it. And I'll tell you why. Because I am Jason, and I am grieving. And this is what grief looks like. Triggers are just part of the process. And so be aware. Be aware of what grief is and what it looks like. Next thing you'll need to grieve well is support. I promise you, you don't need time alone. You need support. And you need a couple different kinds of support. We're going to talk about each of these. The first kind of support you need is just practical support. This is your friends and family that come alongside you to just help you carry the burden of life in those first few hours and days and weeks, and for some people, months. Some of you might know the name Rick Warren, Pastor Rick Warren out of Southern California. He and his wife, Kay, lost one of their children to suicide a few years ago. Rick and Kay have shared the story of how they got through that first night. Rick and Kay have been a part of a small group with the same 4 couples for 23 years. Imagine how powerful that would be, right? And the way they share the story about that first night they lost their son, every couple in their group just showed up at their house. And they brought pillows and they brought sleeping bags and they just camped out. They crashed at the place. They slept on couches, they slept on the floor, any place they could find room, right? Listen, they didn't call Rick and Kay to ask them if they needed anything. They just showed up and started loving and started serving. That's the kind of support that we need. And I know some of you here in Waukesha, some of you listening right now, some of my friends in Pewaukee, you're not really going through a season of grief right now, and that's great. Then consider this your challenge to be that practical support for someone in your life, because I'll bet you know someone who's grieving, and this is your opportunity to be the practical support for them. Next kind of support you're going to need is pastoral support. Pastoral support. This is why you got to get back to church. And I know how hard it is, but you got to get back to church as fast as you can and as often as you can. You got to stay connected to truth and worship. And you got to stay after service to be prayed for at the front of the stage. This is also why our church here, we offer a program called Stephen Ministry. A Stephen minister is someone who has been trained to walk alongside you through a season of your life, especially a season of grief. And I've met most of our Stephen ministers. They are the most gifted and compassionate people you can meet. And they would love to walk alongside you through your season. You can find out more information on our website or stop by the Next Steps Hub at either campus. So you need practical support, pastoral support, and the last thing you need is professional support. You just need someone with a professional perspective to help you navigate all of the emotional challenges and things that you're going to face. All right? For many of you, counseling would be a great step. I've been in counseling. It's a wonderful thing. We've got a list of local counselors available at the Next Steps Hub at both campuses if you need a referral. All right, counseling is a great step. This is also why we offer a program called Grief Share. And Grief Share is not a River Glen thing. This is a national program. Churches all over the country run this program. And it's a group-based 12-week-long program to just help you understand what is grief, led by someone who's been trained to do it. I've been through it, and I can tell you, it is powerful, and it is practical, and it is helpful. You can hop on the Grief Share website and find the next one happening close to you. All right, so 3 things you need to grieve well. You need, this is hard, guys, I'm sorry. You need awareness, you need support, and you need perspective. And perspective is it's just how you see things. The things themselves don't change, but how you see them changes. Well, some of you know this story. There's a country music star named Granger Smith who lost his son in a drowning accident a few years ago. As you can imagine, him and his wife were just devastated by this loss. Almost didn't make it through it. For Granger, the pain got so bad he tried to take his own life to escape the pain. Thankfully, he lived through it, and he talks about his journey in his book, Like a River. River was his son's name. It's a great book, great book. And in the book, he talks about how it took a while, but eventually his perspective changed. Over time, he stopped asking the why question. Why? Why did this happen? Why did you do this? Why did you take my son? And instead, he began asking, what? What are you doing through this? What are you trying to teach me? How are you going to carry us through this? How are you going to grow us? How are you going to use us and use this for you? Writing that book was one of the ways God's answered his prayer. And in his book, he says this great line. This is for anybody who's ever gone through pain. He says this, every pain has meaning. And that means that in every pain, there is purpose. And for many, it's as simple as sharing your story with others in a similar situation, being a light for those still fumbling in the dark. I want you to hear from a River Glen family who've gone through the grief journey, and they are now being a light for the rest of us. Their story is unbelievable and it's powerful, but I warn you, their story is hard. They also lost a son a few years ago. But as you're about to see, our God has been with them every step of the way. Take a look.
Hi, I'm Rick. This is my wife, Erin. We've been attending River Glen at the Waukesha campus for about 6 years.
Logan was funny. Like, he was always the kid, making everybody laugh. He had a very charismatic personality and liked to just play around and goof around.
So on Valentine's Day 2021, Erin and I were sitting on our couch just watching TV. We got a phone call just after 8 o'clock. It was a phone call from our son, Logan's best friend. He was kind of frantic, and he said, Mrs. Rockwell, you need to call the UWM Police Department. So we knew that something was obviously going on. We didn't know what. So our other son, Caden, who was 18 at the time, was out. We called him home. We decided to actually just get in the car and drive down to UWM. We were only about 30 minutes away.
We got there and we got into the hallway. Rick was parking the van, and Caden and I were in this little waiting area waiting for a police officer to come get us. And Caden, our other son, just almost collapsed, shaking, almost like a seizure-like shake. And I was just trying to stay strong for him, like holding him up. And they brought us into a room, and they told us that Logan was found about an hour prior, dead in his dorm room, and that he had taken a pill. And they were suspecting at the time, we now know was confirmed that it had fentanyl in it.
It was very difficult getting through the first 24 hours. At first it was shock, disbelief. I always tell people, now I really know what heartache, where that term came from, because you feel like there's this huge weight just crushing you. And it does hurt. It hurts here so bad. We just leaned on each other. I mean, that was the first 24 hours. It was hard to get out of bed, hard to do anything. It was just kind of being in a fog, a blur.
I remember distinctly, we were in bed most of the day, several days, I think. But there was one thing that was really specific that I felt like I needed, and it was very strange. I could not sleep unless I was on Rick's shoulder. It was almost like a baby needing to be cradled. It was very strange. We would wake up in the middle of the night just with crying spells. It was just so much shock. Like, this is really happening. Like, how could this happen? We had this somewhat perfect, normal family.
Yeah, a lot of questioning, a lot of, what happened, why. So the loss, how it affected us in our relationship with God. The first thing is, it's probably natural to be angry and to question and say, why did this happen? How can you let this happen? Why did it happen to us? But that also leads to seeking and just to more understanding. Our faith was strong to begin with, so we knew that God was there and God was with us It's been 3 years, just over 3 years since Logan passed. And as far as where we're at in our grief journey, still struggling. I think we are understanding, I think, that God has a plan for us. And God's plan, we can't comprehend. I do have the understanding, I do have the eternal view that I will see him again. So I feel strong in that. And I think we both do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There is grieving of other things that we lose in life. You know, even a divorce is a grieving process. You know, a relationship loss is a grieving process. So, you know, not to discount those types of grieving things as well, because I think that's important. Grief Share taught us, again, that the sorrow is part of this whole process of why we're here. That's why Jesus died on the cross. That's why, you know, that's why he went through what he went through on earth. Through Grief Share, there was just so many stories and so many things that helped me see the big picture, that this is part of faith. This is the faith part. It's easy to trust God when it's good. It's challenging, but fulfilling to trust him when it's not.
You need to go through it. You can't go around it. That's just going to prolong the pain. Lean on people that are there for you. I mean, it's surprisingly how many people are willing to help. There
still are days that you don't always feel like you're going to make it, and I'm just being really raw and honest. I think that's part of grief. And even though it's been 3 years, it feels like it's yesterday. The pain just doesn't lessen for some reason, and sometimes it intensifies. There's not a doubt in my mind we're not going to make it through this. There just isn't. Like, we have to, because God's going to use Logan's story. He already is. We're seeing it, you know, and that gives me hope.
Can we give them a hand for sharing their story? I hope you heard hope in that story. As deep and devastating as the pain they went through, I love what she said, that it is challenging but yet fulfilling to hold on to hope through that. Logan's family have gone on to start the Love Logan Foundation to celebrate his life and to save additional lives through bringing awareness to families who are struggling with substance abuse and mental health challenges. You can find out more information about that on their website. We celebrate them. What we believe determines how we grieve. We will grieve, every one of us. What we believe determines how we will go through it. And God in his mercy will give us the awareness and the support and the perspective we need. And through that, I hope that we'll all find that grief is hard, but it's not hopeless. And it's long, but it's not endless. And it is complex, but it's not impossible. And you may even find that God's going to use you and your grief to be a light to serve others. We started off our time singing songs and talking about music. Our band has picked the perfect song to close out our service today. I hope this song finds you right where you're at. And I hope when service is done, you come forward and get prayed for.